The Avro Lancaster became the iconic British heavy bomber of the Second World War, in part due to its large bomb capacity and good performance. These two factors made it suitable for a number of unique, difficult and high-profile operations during that conflict. Derived from the earlier and unsuccessful Manchester medium bomber, the Lancaster went on to perform with distinction during the war, whilst also finding its way into a number of different roles including maritime, reconnaissance, cargo transport and civilian use. Finally though, it was replaced by an updated derivative of the aircraft known as the Avro Lincoln in the mid-1950s. Join me in this video as I build and review the Avro Lancaster B MkI/3 plastic model kit in 1/72nd scale from Revell. Hi, I'm Matt and you're watching Model Minutes. As usual, before I start the video, please remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Revell recommends this kit to those aged 10 years and older. If you'd like to see a more in-depth look at the contents of the box, the sprues and instructions, you can find an unboxing review on this kit on my channel. For this video though, I will primarily be focusing on the build of the kit. Having removed the parts from the box, the large sprues were washed in warm, soapy water. This will help remove any oil or grease left over from the moulding process, which can prevent cement and paint from sticking to the plastic properly. With this done, I left the plastic parts to air dry. I will begin the build with the internal cockpit areas. Throughout the construction of this kit, I will either snip the parts from the sprues with my cutters or use a sharp knife. The excess plastic and rough areas, including any flash, can then be trimmed away with a knife or sanded smooth using a sanding stick. Various internal details are removed here, including the floors, control column and pilot's seat. It's worth noting that there are two different versions of the aircraft included in this kit, a B1 or a B3 version. As a result, you should choose which one to do before starting, as there will be a number of different parts depending on your choice. The pilot seat is one of these parts, a second one being present for the other version. I have opted to build the B3 version because I think the paint scheme is a little more interesting. The control panel, control column and pilot seat can all be cemented to the cockpit floor. I'm using Revell Contactor cement here as I find the needle applicator helps place the cement quite accurately. This assembled cockpit area can now be cemented to the top of the longer internal floor part. This has a number of locating holes moulded into it, which really helps with the placement. This can now be followed by the two chairs for the navigator and flight engineer, along with their work table. A bulkhead, which comes in two halves, can be cemented together. This is then glued into the slots in the table, which separates the two workstations. With that done, the floor assembly is now flipped onto its side, and the two end bulkheads for the bomb bay can be cemented into place. The bomb bay bulkheads have two little holes in them. These are for windows to observe the bomb bay. I used PVA glue to attach these parts, brushing the glue into place and then carefully positioning the clear windows. These parts are very small, so a great deal of care, patience and the use of different tools might be needed to get them in the right place. The PVA glue will dry clear and strong, but until then this part will have to be handled carefully. An internal wing spar component can now be cemented onto the internal floor part. This will help add strength to the model when the wings are added later. Humbrol 78 Cockpit Green Matte Acrylic was now painted onto this internal area. I have already thinned this paint in the pot using Tamiya Acrylic Thinner X20A for two reasons. The first is that I'm running low on this colour and this will help prolong its life. The second is to prevent leaving brush strokes in the paint finish as it dries, but a few thin layers might be needed to get a good uniform finish. Humbrol 32 Dark Grey Matte Acrylic was next to be used. This is one of the newer batches of paint from Humbrol, and I feel as though they have changed their formula slightly. This paint is already quite thin and applied well straight from the pot, so I didn't see the need to thin it any further. I'm using this paint during this build on various internal areas that should be black. Although this isn't black, it is an incredibly dark grey however, and I feel it will help apply some interesting contrasting effects. I used this paint on various internal areas including the control panel, control column and instruments. A fine brush helps get it all in the right place whilst avoiding the previously painted areas. The bomb bay will also get entirely coated in this paint. A thicker brush would help apply it more quickly, but care would need to be taken to make sure you don't paint over those clear little windows in the ends of the bulkheads. Humbrol 26 matte khaki acrylic was painted onto the surface of the work table, whilst Humbrol 86 light olive matte acrylic was applied to the surfaces of the seats. There are decals included for various parts of the internal areas, including the seats and control panels. They were cut from the decal sheet and then soaked in warm water to release them from the backing paper. I brushed Humbrol decal fix in the relevant locations and then carefully slid the decals off the backing paper and placed them on the parts. More decal fix can be applied over the top of the decal and it will help soften it into the surface details and make it appear painted on. I would like to point out at this stage though that the instructions weren't pretty clear on the seat belts. I applied the decal to the detail on the pilot's chair, but it didn't seem to really fit properly. This led me to the conclusion that the detail on the pilot's chair should be painted on, and the two sets of seatbelt decals are actually for the two chairs at the workstation. Seems a little obvious now that I mention it. Nonetheless, it didn't look too bad, and when the fuselage is closed you wouldn't really be able to notice it anyway. Here, the two fuselage halves are ready to receive some paint. Humbrol 78 was again used, much like the earlier stages, to paint the internal areas of the fuselage. Humbrol 32 was then used on the nose area and the bomb bay sides. You'll be able to notice that I've only painted the areas that I think are going to be visible through the cockpit windows. You could paint the entire fuselage, but I thought that would be a bit of a waste in my case. With that done and having picked out some of the instruments on the fuselage walls, they too were ready to receive some decals, which were again applied in the same way as the earlier ones. Humbrol 11 silver acrylic was now dry brushed onto these areas. Removing most of the paint from the brush until it feels dry, the residue can be worked over the details and it will start to highlight them, whilst leaving the recessed areas completely untouched. I did this on all the internal areas I had previously painted, including the cockpit and bomb bay. Citadel Nuln Oil acrylic wash was then applied to these areas and would help give an element of weathering, by giving the appearance of dirt and grime. It will pool in the recessed areas and apply elements of shade and contrast, helping to bring out the details. I normally remove the excess wash using a cotton bud soaked in acrylic thinners, but I won't bother doing this here, as I feel the internal areas would be quite difficult to clean in real life and would have an increased amount of surface dirt and grime. Here, some little holes need to be opened up so they can take some external components later. I followed the moulded guides and simply used my knife to cut away the plastic. The clear parts for the windows in the fuselage can now be glued in place. As with the clear parts earlier, I applied PVA glue using a fine brush, then carefully placed the windows into their slots. Some of these windows are going to be painted over later as per the instructions, so for those ones it won't really matter if you use polycement for those. But as the polycement can fog up clear parts, you should really avoid using it on the ones you can see through, which is why I'm using PVA. Here, two parts which make up the base of the dorsal turret are cemented together. It will then be painted in the same cockpit green colour as the rest of the interior of the aircraft. Now it's time to cement the internal components into one half of the fuselage. Provided you've assembled this correctly, everything should line up okay, but it might still need a little fiddling to get it in the right place. You'll be able to notice that a smaller spar component is also cemented into the slots in the rear of the fuselage, which will help hold the tail surfaces in place later. With that done, The fuselage halves can be cemented together. It's worth noting that the dorsal turret should only be placed in the retaining grooves in the fuselage and not cemented. That is, if you would like the option to rotate it. Care must be taken to get the fuselage lined up accurately and then pressure applied until it has set. I ran some Tamiya extra thin cement along these seams to help bond them together. This cement is really good at running into gaps like this. A few areas needed a little filler. I used Humbrol model filler to do this, and it was simply forced into the gap using a cotton bud and then left to dry. I will then sand the seam smooth using some fine sandpaper to help hide the joins. It's time to move on to the wings. They come in two halves and these were cemented together. In hindsight, I should have painted the internal areas black here, as when I come to do it later it will be a little more difficult to do. The tail surfaces also come in two halves and required the same treatment as the wings. These horizontal tail surfaces can now be cemented into place on the spars which are protruding from the fuselage. I found this to be quite a helpful inclusion which ensured good alignment and prevented them from drooping down when in place. This is then repeated for the wings, which again is quite straightforward thanks to these protruding wing spar components. With that done, it's time to move on to the assembly of the Merlin engine. You get two engines included in this kit and can install them in the inboard nacelles if you want. I chose to build and install one of the engines, and later I will remove the nacelle panels so it can be seen. If you can't see the engine, I don't see much point in building and including it though, so I think it's better to keep it in the spares box for another project. It's not too difficult to assemble, the parts fit quite well and it looks alright when it's finished. It can be a little fiddly getting the exhaust pipes to sit at the right angle though, so watch out for that. The engine needs to be attached to a bulkhead and frame, so these parts were next to be assembled. This was a little fiddly with trying to get the frame arms in their holes and to sit at all the correct angles. With that done, the engine can now be cemented onto the arms of the frame. Again, a little fiddly, but not impossible. In hindsight, I should have painted these elements before doing this, but I was concerned I wouldn't get a good bond with the cement, as I wasn't sure exactly where the parts came into contact, but the painting won't be too difficult. The frame and bulkhead were given a coat of the same Humbrol 78 cockpit green as all the previous internal areas, then the engine was painted with Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey, which was also thinned to help it flow better. I used a fine brush to apply this paint and to avoid getting it in any unwanted places. Humbrol 171 antique bronze metallic paint was next to be used, and it was dry brushed onto the exhaust pipes to give a representation of rusting or heat damage. I also lightly dry brushed the entire assembly to help highlight some of the details. I repeated the dry brushing, but this time with Humbrol 11 silver to further bring out the details and apply yet another layer of contrast in the metalwork. With that done, the next step was to add these components to the landing gear bays. They were carefully cemented into place, making sure I got them the right way round. These are then followed by more bulkheads and spars. Care must be taken to get them in the right place and make sure they are all aligned correctly, as otherwise you might have some trouble adding the nacelles later. These final parts at the front of the landing gear bays will later have the landing gear legs attached to them and will also form the mounting points for the engines. These areas were now painted with Humbrol 32 dark grey. As previously mentioned, it would have been much easier to do this earlier, as now all these components make it difficult to make sure the paint reaches all the areas inside the wing. But with a little care and patience I managed to get there. The internal areas of the nacelles have already been given a coat of their relevant colours. I'm going to follow the moulded lines to remove the panels from this nacelle on the port side of the aircraft so that the engine can be viewed. I carefully followed these lines using my knife. A number of passes would be needed to get a good solid cut through the plastic. I had to take care to avoid damaging this part as I did this though. With that done, the cut lines can be cleaned up by sanding them smooth or trimming the rough areas with the knife. A small retaining part can be cemented onto the base plate for the propeller. The way this kit has been designed allows for the props to be rotated if you assemble it carefully. I did find that it wasn't exactly the best design though, and the retaining pin wasn't really fit for purpose, with the base plate not really being held in place. So I do end up cementing mine onto the nacelles in the end, as I'm not really fussed about my props being able to turn. If you want yours to rotate though, just watch out for this. With this base plate and the engine cemented in place, the nacelle halves can now be cemented together. I then glued the air intake and radiator component into place. It did take a little bit of manipulation to get it to line up correctly, but with persuasion it was possible. Some small intakes are now cemented into their slots in the sides of the engine nacelle. All these steps would be repeated 3 more times for the other 3 nacelles, but not including the construction of the engine and the removal of the panels, which makes them considerably easier and quicker to do. The nacelle can now be cemented into place on the wing of the aircraft. So here I am speeding through the other large nacelle on the opposite wing. It follows the same format as the previous one, but as you can see, the lack of adding an engine makes it somewhat simpler and easier. The only thing different is that you can see the addition of the exhausts on the outside. You get 2 different exhaust pipes in this kit, but these were the ones that I needed for my version. And once again, when it's complete, it is cemented into place on the wing. The small nacelles have considerably fewer components as they don't need to take into account the landing gear bays, so these are assembled much quicker and in a similar fashion, and then also cemented to the wings. It's at this point that the model is starting to look like a Lancaster bomber. Now it's time to add the landing gear legs. It's worth mentioning that if you want to display the landing gear raised, then this option is included. The bay covers simply cement into place in the closed position. But this kit doesn't come with pilot or crew figures, so you would have to source some in order to really display it in a flying position. The installation of the landing gear legs is somewhat fiddly and tedious. Each leg has a number of slots which it needs to fit in, then have another support strut attached which, due to gravity, wants to not sit in the correct place without a bit of support, and this was a time-consuming stage, but it looks quite good when it's done. The landing gear bay covers can now be cut in half using a knife and cleaned up. They will be cemented to either side of the bays. They have some little rods which attach them to the landing gear legs too, which, again, was a frustrating and time-consuming job, but eventually I got there. I won't add the wheels yet, I'll do that closer to the end of the build. Now it's time to focus on the bomb bay. Some arms are cemented to the front and rear bulkheads which will hold the bay covers open, but you can display the bomb bay closed if you want to. I then moved on to cementing all the bomb mounting points into place. There are quite a few of these, so again this became a repetitive task, but it wasn't too difficult. Although a number of bombs and different options for loading the bomb bay are included, I won't actually be adding the bombs to my model as I don't want to use them as part of the story of my diorama, which I will build later. The bomb bay doors are similar to the landing gear ones as they need to be cut in half then cleaned up. They were then cemented into place on the bottom of the bomb bay. This component will hold the radar dish on the underside of the aircraft, but to do that, this hole needs to be opened up. I did this using a fine drill bit. It can then be cemented into the hole in the bottom of the aircraft. The tail wheel leg can be cemented into the hole at the rear of the aircraft, and the leg will push inside the model until it meets with the tail spar that was added much earlier. It will then be in the correct place and at the correct height. This component can now be cemented into the locating slots in the bottom of the aircraft. The fairing which surrounds the dorsal turret can now also be added. Some more clear parts need to be added to the top of the model. Again, I used PVA to do this. It's worth noting that although they look to be the same size, one is actually larger than the other. You must make sure you get these the right way round, because otherwise you won't get one of them to fit in place. With that done and the majority of parts now added onto the model, I felt it was time to start some painting. Humbrol 24 Trainer Yellow Matte Acrylic paint was thinned and then brushed onto the wingtips. I will need about 3 layers of this paint to get a good even finish, ensuring I leave enough time between coats for it to dry. I will also use this paint on the vertical tail surfaces, but before I do this, small components will need to be added into those little slots. This is a fiddly step as they are absolutely tiny and you run the risk of losing or damaging them. The ailerons also needed some components added to them before I moved on to paint those areas. Additionally, I thought it would be a good idea to add the aerials on the nose of the aircraft before I painted that area too. With the yellow paint now completely dry, masking tape was applied to help protect it and ensure a nice straight line would exist between it and the camouflage which was to come next. I used Vallejo liquid mask to protect the circular windows and rectangular windows in the fuselage of the aircraft, as due to the shape of these parts I thought it would be easier than cutting tape to match. The liquid mask has now dried and it's time to apply Humbrol 29 Dark Earth Matte Acrylic to the entire top surface of the aircraft. Again, this was thinned with Tamiya thinners and a number of coats would be needed to get a uniform layer. I usually start from the lightest colour and work to the darkest, as I find it harder to cover a dark colour with a light one. With that paint now dry, Humbrol 30 dark green acrylic paint was also thinned and then applied to the model in a camouflage pattern. I did this freehand and followed the painting instructions by eye. The entire top surfaces are now finished and have dried. I've applied masking tape along the edges of the model in line with the painting instructions. This will make sure I get good, straight and crisp lines between the camouflage and the black paint I'm about to apply. Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic was thinned just like the previous paints and then applied to the sides and underside of the model. I used a wide flat brush to do this, trying to get good even coverage, but some areas, particularly those hard to reach, would require a finer brush later. Again, a number of coats will be needed. Here the paint has been applied and is now dry. The masking tape can be removed to reveal the straight lines between the different colours. I was actually impressed how well this all turned out. There were only a few very minor bleeds of colour to tidy up. Removing the tape on the fuselage was particularly satisfying, revealing that clear and crisp line between the colours. The vertical tail surfaces can now be cemented into place, and I had to take care here to avoid getting the cement in the wrong places, which could ruin the paint finish. The cockpit canopy comes with different window options depending on the version you are building. I identified the correct parts and then glued them together using PVA glue again. Whilst that PVA is drying, I will give the entire model a coat of this Plasticoat Satin Sealer spray paint to protect the previous layers and give a uniform finish before the application of decals. A quick word of warning, please ensure you use the correct PPE and environment when spray painting to help protect yourself. I do most of my spray painting outside and away from the camera. The main wheels come in 2 halves and simply need cementing together. Here, this cheap black matte spray paint is going to be used on all of these parts, including the wheels and propellers, simply because it would be quicker than hand brushing each one. This clear part houses the airborne radar, and I have masked the part which must remain clear. It was also given a quick spray with the black paint for ease, and when it was dry, the tape was removed. Now it's time to apply the decals. These were done in the same manner as the decals in the cockpit. They were soaked in warm water until they released from the backing paper. Decal fix was brushed onto the model, then the decals were slid into place. When they are in position, more decal fix can be added to help soften them further. The satin paint I applied earlier will help avoid leaving the silvering effect that a matte finish can cause on decals. Some of them have to be done before others though. These walkway ones need to be in place before the wing roundels are applied. The transfers do apply quite well to the model. The only issues I had were that some of them were quite large, so were a little bit of a struggle to get into place without tearing them. They do conform to the surface detail quite well, but did need some encouragement in places. With the decals in place and curing, I moved on to paint the cockpit canopy frames. I had already painted it with 29 dark earth, then went over the top in 30 dark green. I used a fine brush to carefully follow the lines. Any errors can be scraped away using a pointed tool. The two machine guns were now cemented into the base plate of the front turret. When they were in position, I gave them a coat of Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey. The turret canopy has already been painted in the same way as the cockpit canopy, but this time using Humbrol 33 matte black. It was then glued to the base plate using PVA to prevent it from fogging up. I then used a couple of drops of polycement on the black plastic and PVA on the clear part to attach the rear of the turret housing. The rear turret was assembled in a very similar manner. The machine guns were pushed into place, then PVA used around all the seams to join the various clear parts to each other and the floor plate. With the turrets drying, the satin sealer made a reappearance and was sprayed over the aircraft again to help seal the decals and give a uniform finish. Here, the tail turret fairings are being added. They were cemented into place and then masked using tape to match the paint finish of the rest of the aircraft. I then painted the missing camouflage onto these areas. You don't have to cement the turrets into place. It is intended that they not be cemented so that they can turn freely, but I found that they kept falling out and that was really annoying. So I used a small amount of cement just to hold them in place. The nose turret was added into its slot and then the retaining part cemented into place over the top. Again, I had to touch this area up with the brown colour so that it matched the rest of the camouflage scheme. The liquid mask I applied earlier can now be removed from the windows and it reveals the clear areas. The cockpit canopy was glued into place, again using PVA. Here I've already touched up the dorsal turret with black paint and will now cement the machine guns into place, which would also be given a coat of the gunmetal paint. PVA was then used to glue the clear turret canopy parts into place. 24 trainer yellow was now used to pick out the tips of the propeller blades using a fine brush. The wheels were then cemented into place onto the landing gear legs. A little care must be taken here as you must bend the legs just a little to get the wheels in, but you do risk snapping them as you do this. I cemented the propellers onto their base plates on the nacelles. The spinners can then be cemented over the top. The radar dome was next to be added to the bottom of the model, having already cemented the dish into place. I used PVA again to attach this clear part. Humbrol 60 matte scarlet was used on the port navigation light slot, whilst I would use 30 dark green on the starboard side to give a hint of the different coloured lights. The clear light cover parts can then be glued into place. Citadel non-oil acrylic wash was now used to bring out the panel line detail on the upper surfaces of the model. It was brushed over the panel lines and then allowed to dry. A cotton bud soaked in acrylic thinners was then used to remove the excess wash, whilst it would remain in the recessed areas. Had I not protected the paint using the satin sealer earlier, all the other acrylic layers would also be removed in this step. I tried to work in the direction of airflow over the aircraft to help emphasise and give an element of weathering. Next, I dry brushed Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic in the areas I thought would get exhaust stains from the engines. and that's as far as I went with my build of the Revell Avro Lancaster B MkI/3 in 1/72 scale. There are a few little improvements that I could make to this model, including the addition of aerial wires and weathering in other areas, but for now I'm calling it done. In the next episode, I will be showing you how I built the display base, painted the figures, and scratch built the scaffold to finish off the diorama. So for now, let's talk about the kit. I quite enjoyed building this one, being one of the larger models I've built on my channel so far. Including the construction of the diorama, it took me about 3 weeks on and off to build. The model has quite good detail. I particularly like the inclusion of visible engines, bombs, and the various different components to depict the two different versions. I'm less of a fan of the lack of a crew though, which pretty much rules out a flying display unless you find some for yourself. There was a little bit of flash on some of the parts in places, but it was manageable to remove and the parts were moulded to a good quality. The fit was generally quite good too, and I didn't really have any issues in that regard. As for the accuracy of the kit though, I couldn't exactly say, as I'm not an expert on the Lancaster, nor am I a rivet counter. It looks alright, and that's good enough for me. That being said, I have heard in various places that it does have some inaccuracies with regards to the nacelle and wing shapes, but I wouldn't consider myself qualified enough to make a comment on that. The decals were well printed and applied okay to the model. I did experience some silvering in places, but that was probably more my fault in not applying enough satin varnish in those areas. A gloss varnish would have helped prevent this better perhaps. The one area that did cause a few headaches were the instructions though. The paint scheme being in black and white did lead to a little confusion and having to check it a number of times. The steps were a little busy in places too, so I had to take some time to check what I was doing here and there. It's something that someone with a little bit of experience of building models shouldn't have any real problems with, but if you're just starting out it could be a bit of a barrier. And speaking of beginners, I wouldn't really recommend this to you, simply due to the sheer number of parts, stages and decals that need to be applied. Perhaps it would be a good idea to start with a few smaller kits and then work your way up to something this big. The version I chose to depict in this kit was that of an Avro Lancaster B MkIII of 100 Squadron Royal Air Force at Elsham Wolds in April 1945. But a B MkI version with a similar but slightly easier paint scheme for an aircraft of No. 9 Squadron RAF Bardney is also included. This kit was newly tooled back in 2007. Replacing the older 1960s version of the Lancaster that was previously in the Revell range. The version I've built in this video is the initial release of this kit. It has been available a few more times since 2007, with different parts to make a Dam Busters Lancaster in 2009, a gift set including paints and glue for Marks and Spencer's here in the UK, which was dated 2010, and as a part of the British Legends gift set from 2018, which came boxed with Spitfire and a Hurricane. So, with the tooling being less than 20 years old, I would say that it's a reasonable plastic model kit of the Lancaster, but it might not be quite as up to date in comparison to more recent releases, such as the version from Airfix, which was newly tooled in 2012. But it might come down to the size of your budget. At the time this kit was given to me, back in 2018, I'm pretty sure that it was purchased for just under £20 here in the UK. At the time this video was made, this kit was retailing for around £25 or so, which is about £10 cheaper than the Airfix version. I know that may well inform my buying decision if I really wanted a Lancaster on my display shelf. But anyway, this is turning into a long video, so let's wrap it up here. In conclusion, this is a reasonably priced kit with good details, mould quality and fit that gets you a fair representation of the Avro Lancaster in 1/72 scale, and I am more than happy with how mine turned out. As always, let me know what you thought of my finished model, build and techniques in the comments below. You can also post suggestions for other kits or videos you might like to see in the future too. As always, a big shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. The contribution these guys make to my channel allow me to purchase all those consumables I use during my builds and even new kits to review, which in turn allows me to create consistent content. A massive thank you to these guys. To find out how you can pledge your support and the perks you get, including early access to videos and behind the scenes stuff amongst other things, take a look at the link in the description. Don't forget you can also connect with me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and even have my own Discord server. Oh, and if you made it this far, make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss part 2 of this build and any future videos I might make. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.